Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this last meeting in these terms of our international lecture series, Planning in Transitions. Hello to everybody out there in the web. We also have a lot of participants from there. Sorry for starting a bit late. We had some technical problems for coming in. And yes, I don't know whether you see us. You probably just see the slides at the moment. So our guest is Bernhard Truffer. As you know, Bernhard will talk today about urban planning meets socio-technical transitions. So looking at the different perspective from a planning perspective, also on transformation, sustainability transitions, with a view on informal settlements and livelihood in Kenya. I think we'll soon hear more about that. And maybe just some words on Bernhard. So Bernhard is professor at Utrecht University and is their professor for geography of transitions in particular. And you know, one of our foremost researchers, I would say, within transition studies, sustainability transitions, who has worked also a lot on different concepts and has published widely in this field. And you know, now beside Utrecht University, he's also leading a department and a group of environmental social science at EAWAG in Zurich. EAWAG is the Aquatic Science Research Center. Almost left out some parts of it, but it's one of the centers of the ETH level in Zurich, and that's also a very nice and large research group which Bernhard has built up there. But feel free to add also additional. Bernhard, maybe just one thing I should also add is that Bernhard is also editor-in-chief of the Journal of Environmental Innovation and Societal Transitions, which always then also offers opportunities to engage a lot with transition research with the whole community. And yeah, I'll just hand over directly to Bernhard and enjoy the talk. And we'll have enough time for discussion afterwards. Bernhard.
I hope so, yes. Oh, it's a bit loud. Can you stand it? Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, thanks a lot, Harald. I'm very happy to be here in Linköping for the first time in my life, and we had promised, you know, drinking beers for a long time over especially the COVID years, and so I'm very happy to be here, and also to talk about some recent insights that I had in my research context about urban planning. I told Harald I sort of slid into it more than, so it was not a sort of a strategy to become an urban planner, but more and more of the things that we did seem to have some quite relevance for urban planning. And so if some urban planners are here in the room, I'm very eager to hear whether, you know, our take on the problem is sort of adequate. And I will focus on informal settlements in the Global South and show you a few examples that we elaborated on in Kenya, Kenyan informal settlement in Nairobi, and then also in several secondary cities. But I guess the whole talk will be a bit concept heavy, so brace yourself, you know, bear with me. I really want to focus on what is the socio-technical perspective, socio-technical systems perspective, potentially bringing to urban planning and urban development that hasn't been there before. So in a sense, it's a bit of a programmatic talk, and I decided to, because I anticipated that not everyone is a full dyed-in-the-wool transition scholar, so I give you a sort of a short introduction, what transitions is all about and what the core concepts are. And then, you know, elaborate a bit on how this resonates with problems that you encounter if you're in a Global South context, but it's nothing specific to the Global South. We can discuss this later. And then where the connection with the urban planning comes in. Perhaps I have to add, as editor-in-chief of ICE, also Wisdom is an editor, and I'm very happy to see him for the first time in person after having collaborated for quite some time already. So I guess the overview, I already said it. I will just go into explaining a bit what transition studies is all about, and you know how it's thought about in let's say, I wrote here OECD countries, but it would be more adequate in Western Europe because that's where it originated really. And then, you know, elaborate a bit how the kind of conceptual challenges we encountered when going to the slums of Nairobi, and then a third part about urban planning. So in order to understand what this is, this transitions field, which is sort of an interdisciplinary field that has emerged in the, I'd say, early 1990s. So you have to understand the realities, you know, the big topics that were coming up, especially in Western Europe. And so one of the, let's say, mobilizing events for us, because we were very young, still PhD students in those times, was the disaster of Chernobyl, which led to a strengthening, I would say, of the distrust that was widely available in societies about, you know, technological progress, that would just be led to the big guys, the engineers, the big companies, etc., and which we learned since the Second World War, that we just have to trust that progress will bring happiness and everything will be fine in the end. It's just, if there were problems, it was just hiccups on the road. But, you know, ultimately the directionality of these developments was leading to happiness and bliss. And then Chernobyl just hit that very strongly. And what we saw there was a number of initiatives, experiments that were set up by even normal citizens, you know, trying to reinvent the car, or some incumbents trying to venture into renewables, although very reluctantly. And to keep it very short, let's say that was at the point where Harald and I finished our PhD. You know, this was sort of the things that said, oh, there's all sorts of things are happening. Will this ever develop into something? If you look today to younger people that I see here in the room, you know, we are in a totally different situation, especially now after Fukushima, that these technologies, you know, electric vehicles or renewable energies, are taken for granted. They're there, they're the cheapest, that's the way to go. And so when I lecture to younger people, they say, yeah, okay, this was the story of your youth. Today is different, so what's the matter? I guess the matter is really, how can we understand these sort of radical transformations, how they happen, how they develop over time, and perhaps even how they can be steered. So in a sense, we, you know, the sustainability transitions community was sort of developing around a few foundational research questions, which I have already alluded to. So the first one is certainly, how can we understand early on when new technologies or new products develop, and they're still in a state of hopeful monstrosities, which means they're not convincing in terms of performance or price or anything, but they bear sort of a promise in themselves to lead to a better world. Like renewable, you know, the wind power plants in the early 90s, etc. They didn't work yet, but, you know, there was something in it that could be transformational. And so how can we understand that from an academic point of view? But the other flip side of the coin is also that we have lots of resistance from the incumbent sectors. So how can we understand, you know, the rationale and the way the processes and mechanisms that stabilize, that lead to path dependencies? And that's not only about the bad big companies, it's also path dependencies are also the everyday routines of customers and users, etc. And the third big question is, of course, if these things happen and if you have a better understanding, does this have any sort of influence on that we can change course? And who could do something to lead the development towards better futures and prevent, you know, developments for a worse future to happen? So taken together, this is sort of about understanding long-term socio-technical change or configurational change. And I would say that there have been very few academic discourses in the 90s and early 2000s that addressed this sort of long-term integrated sort of problems. And I will not say how the economists would have framed it or the psychologists, but you can just take it that they were not interested in these long-term sort of structural change processes. Okay, so the theorizing around these research questions, you know, to understand that, you have to go back a bit into the mid-80s, you know, where the sort of a movement of social scientists arguing against techno-determinism and progress determinism came up, and which has become known as the field of science and technology studies, So the history of technology, sociology of technologies, they became very important to show how technologies were shaped very strongly by social processes. And on the side of the economists, there was let's say, these alternative economies, or evolution economics was formulated, and which went essentially against the sort of mechanistic rational actor optimization paradigm. And this opened up a few ideas and framework on which then the community built and developed. So if you want to say, well, what is it really trying to explain, then it's how these social and technical conditions sort of co-evolve and co-shape each other. There's been this very famous phrase of Ari Ripp and Röre Kemp about, it's all about making configurations that work, and configurations of technologies, infrastructures, but also societal conditions, institutions, regulations, etc. And the social dimension was, I would say, was strongly approached from a structural point of view. So it was all about what are the rules that are developed or develop around the new technologies, and then shape how users and policymakers and industry deal with this sort of technology. So rules are a very important aspect in it, and we'll come back in the later parts of the talk. And then finally, it's about understanding these sort of fundamental shifts, you know, that could happen once in a while, and that go very deep in reorganizing the structures as they had it established. So, you know, around these sort of explanatory needs or interests, we had a few core concepts and frameworks, I guess, or rather concepts that have developed. One is the one of socio-technical systems, which is essentially to say, well, we have to understand something like nuclear power as a socio-technical system. So the social and the technical co-determine each other and stabilize each other. The rules part has been translated as regimes. So these are sort of the highly institutionalized rules that exist in a socio-technical regime and that determine, you know, the development pathway that is possible and what's more difficult to achieve. This leads into path dependencies, and you know, in terms of the long-term evolution, it has been taken from the start that these systems develop in sort of punctuated equilibria and are not sort of continuous changes in equilibria as economists would have it. Punctuated equilibria means you can have very long situations where the system remains more or less stable and varies only marginally. And then certainly at a certain point, you might have very quick phases of reconfiguration, after which you would again have a sort of a stabilized development. So, you know, if you go now to how this was implemented and, you know, operationalized and illustrated in, especially in Western Europe originally, we have to start from a sort of a historical observation that actually quite a number of technological fields, like for instance, the electricity sector or the automobile sector, you can describe as a sort of a punctuated equilibria kind of pattern, saying that, you know, here you have the x-axis is the time, and for a long time you have a sort of configurations of knowledge, of sectoral policies, of user practices, technologies, infrastructures, etc., that are sort of quite stable. You know, take the automobile, let's say 20 years ago, until 10 years ago, it was very clear what a car is, that everyone wants to have a car as soon as possible in life, and that everything of our personal lives will be organized around an internal combustion engine car. And this remained sort of stable from the, I would say, 1930s or so to 2010. This was sort of not challenged in any ways. But then we have these sort of phases of transformation, and then we end up with something other. And what we see currently is the electrification of the automobile. So we were on the way to a rapid restructuring for an electrification of individual transport. And this will need new configuration, new alignments between technological, infrastructural, and social elements. And this was, you know, the well-known framework, or one of the most well-known frameworks in transition studies is the so-called multi-level perspective. Even though I maintain it's a misnomer, it's not about levels really. But let's say these sort of stable, existing structures were framed as socio-technical regimes, which is sort of configurations of rules regarding technology, user practices, policy, etc., that are sort of can be observed and described and which will remain stable for a long time. And they are the regime is sort of the highly institutionalized core of this socio-technical system. But of course, at any time, there are also options that are perhaps, not well developed and are sort of aberration in compared to the dominant design or the dominant paradigm. And this was captured as sort of technological niches. And they are essentially immature social technical systems, where, as I showed for the solar vehicles, they have not full functionality. There's perhaps no regulatory structure that fits these new options. The user don't know what to do with them. Their symbolic meaning is not yet fixed. And so they cannot compete against the established technologies. And what you have at the third level, as it was called, outside, you have sort of external pressures that will influence, the stability of the established regime, or also how well these alternatives can grow. And so the story, the stylized narrative is that, at any moment in time, you have these sort of niche processes that will then, under certain conditions defined by a landscape, will then aggregate and then lead to a transformation and speed this up. So that's about the core of this framework. And I would, rather than going deeper into that, just give you an illustration of a transformation that's sort of ongoing, or rather in its very early stage still. And this is the case of urban water in OECD countries, I would say. Here, we could say Western Europe, but the OECD countries is good enough. So if you think about, what happens with the water that we have used in our households or in industry. So we have found since about the 1920s, a technological approach has been defined and then refined in the 60s and 70s, which can be considered a huge success. Because our cities have become clean places that are not hygienic problematic. The water is evacuated from the cities quickly enough. And so everyone, there's a strong engineering culture also that considers that this is sort of the gold standard, the solution that everyone should have and that works very well. And we see in some countries like Switzerland or Austria or the Netherlands, where you have this centralized sewer wastewater treatment has become sort of the dominant form. How we over 97% of the households are connected to centralized sewers. In Sweden, it's a bit different because of the summer houses, but if we take away the summer houses, it would perhaps be at a similar level. To take it very short, so urban water management has developed a very strong regime. The rules that define how wastewater has to be dealt with is very solid, is uncontested. And the variations that we see, there's still innovation going on, but there's sort of marginal, within the dominant design, you have marginal further developments, etc. And this to a point where it has really become a sort of what some have called a global regime. So if you can go to almost all the places in the world and they will say, that's what we want to achieve. That's the gold standard, and we know exactly how to do it. So a typical sort of regime that's sort of closed in itself and doesn't know much of a challenge. Unfortunately, if we approach this sector from a sustainability point of view, and we think about how suitable is it really under conditions of climate change, or if we relate it to the development question, how many people in the world are really connected to this gold standard? We see that this is only a partial success. It only works under very specific conditions. And we have large parts of the world that have very low connection rates and associated hygienic problems, etc. So it seems that it's not really, at least the jury is out whether this is the global gold standard. Really, the promises have been out everywhere. I'm sure also in Ghana, Kenya, everywhere, said, one day we will have the sewers and then everything will be fine. But after 50 years, there's very little progress, and there seems to be something deeper that's a problem here. in this logic of regime, niche, and landscape, you can also say there's quite a number of radical and disruptive technologies out there or systems. So here's just an example of an upfall shower that has been developed by a Dutch, which essentially takes a bucket of water and circulates it. So you always shower with the same water. And so you're independent of any intake of water. You could put this into your living room or wherever you want, and it would just operate on its own. Another one is, there's quite a lot of activity in the realm of gray water treatment, where you can just your wash basin water or shower water, etc., gets treated, and you can use it for gardening or whatever. Or here, one of the things that have been developed in my institute in Switzerland is sort of independent hand washing station. I guess that's in Durban in South Africa, which you can just put in an informal settlement and people can just wash their hands, and it doesn't need or almost doesn't need any input from water. Long story short, so there would be sort of niche technologies that would require or drive the system into a radically different direction, where we would not need to have these long sewers anymore, etc. So the question is, what would it take to transform this sector into a more sustainable one? And if you would ask that for Sweden, which would be an interesting question, and people are working on that, then you would be in a sort of a very conventional transitions analysis. And we can talk about Sweden. I know a little bit about Sweden, so there's lots of interesting stuff going on. So if you want to do that, do that. I guess I would want to take a different turn here in my talk and say, well, what happens with these frameworks if you take it to radically different, or let's say institutionally different and more complex contexts? And, are these concepts really still performative, or do you have to change it? And of course, we have to change it. So if you now think about how can we think about an urban water management transition in a place like Nairobi in Kenya, and then you see that lots of the assumptions that we have about what are urban structures look quite different. So here you have, I guess it's Kibera, one of the biggest informal settlements in the world. 1 million inhabitants, are estimated to live there. You have, of course, some building blocks that are sort of, creeping into the informal settlement, etc. You have this sort of typical situation, which is, of course, not the same as we have here in Linköping or in Switzerland or in Utrecht, etc. If you think about domestic spaces, so then of course, that's the living conditions that you have with the sheds, etc. Very confined space to operate a household, etc. If you think about regimes, what are the forms that people use or services that people use to get rid of their digestive end products? You have, for instance, public toilets, they typically look like that. And there's also some niche activities, from international NGOs and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, etc. So lots of actors are active, also, of course, community-based organizations of the slum itself. They try with new forms, etc. So you have all the elements, you have the regimes and the niches, you have the landscape pressures. So can you just do the same as you would do in Sweden? And what it took us, one first observation is, of course, that we have a much wider variety of and functionality of the different forms, but still a high persistence. So how could we now conceptualize these regimes and niches, perhaps, in such a context? And we noticed that the conventional approach doesn't work. We have to at least introduce 2 layers, differentiate between 2 layers. You could even call them levels if you wanted, but let's not go there. To address that. And the one level was what they call the service regimes. So that's, let's say, a public toilet would be a specific form of a service regime, like in the transport case. Here worldwide, you would say the automobile is sort of a technology that provides access or spatial connection as an individual means of transport. Public transport can do the same. You can also bicycle, etc. So you have different sort of service options that can be developed, can be innovated, and will develop along certain also path-dependent trajectories. But beyond that, we also have, or for people, it's often that they don't have just access to one of these options, but they can just play around with different ones. So the stability of the system is also defined at the sectoral level. So how these services relate to each other. And so here it would be, the traffic rules, let's say also urban planning, of course, that there's then influenced and shaped by how these service regimes develop over time, that will also create a sort of stabilizing layer. So essentially, very simple idea to say, okay, we have to conceptualize regimes in a more complex context. And this is not, you don't have to go into an informal settlement, it's true in general. It makes sense to differentiate these two levels. And what you get then, I will now show you how you can identify and operationalize these two concepts. So and how this shapes also the understanding of transitions. So you can have the service regimes, which are sort of social technical systems that provide a certain basic service. And we did that through a sort of a practice lens. And that's very important to understand if you're interested in the rules, let's say the structural dimensions of such social technical systems. Then, a naive understanding would be, oh, we just go and we list all the rules that are there. So we do interviews, the people tell us the rules, and then we know we can map all the rules, that guide the behavior of actors. But often, these rules are not so, known to the people when acting in their daily lives. So another approach would be to say, well, we have to observe how they organize themselves and the regular patterns. And that's sort of a way that you can measure or identify the rules, because they're so implicit. And if you wanted to explicate them, this would be a never-ending task. Also because often it's not very conscious. And we took from the practice literature, social practices literature, a few dimensions to describe what are the rules, which kind of rules do we have to assess in order to understand the regime as it develops. And here you have sort of, of course, a technological dimension or material dimension. That's the infrastructure and artifacts. Then you have the symbolic rationale and meaning. And you have the social interaction that's organized around these artifacts. You have the time and space where it happens, and also an organizational modes, how these services are provided. Who provides and how can you access, etc. Very simple idea. So we went then into, we structured what we observed in Kibera and the other informal settlements, and we identified like 5 service regimes. So the first one is, of course, the domestic sewer regime. So there are some pockets that have a sort of a sewage or a water flush toilet, etc. Many more just go to public toilets, and I don't want to go into the details here. I guess you get it, or you could read the papers. It's all elaborated. It's more about the big picture here. Another form is that, there are sort of, sorry, I just mixed them. The second one was the shared on-site. So typically you have a toilet that's shared, a pit latrine that's shared by several households, and then the neighbors share the access to the toilet and the maintenance of the toilet, etc. But most, I would say most of the people, they have access to public sanitation regimes where they typically have to pay something. And then you saw the picture, there is perhaps a dozen of these toilets. So they have to be operated differently, etc. But we would also say that, the open defecation is also sort of a regime, because if you want to defecate openly in an urban context like Nairobi, you cannot just do that haphazardly. You also have to follow certain rules. It's certain times of the day. It's different for women than for men, etc., etc. So also this has sort of a regime-like character, even though the technology part is perhaps not so important. Well, one form of open defecation is the so-called flying toilets, where people defecate into sort of plastic bags, and then in the morning they throw it on the roofs of neighbors. You have a certain technology component. But let's say it's a regime in its own right, and then you have all these what you could call niches, but we would not want to make such a big distinction between regimes and niches that are promoted by sort of NGOs, Bill and Melinda Gates foundations, etc. And there, a field of these are called container-based solutions, where you have essentially a toilet that has a bucket downstairs or below the toilet, and then an organization comes like once a week and takes the cartridge out and puts an empty one in, and then organizes the treatment of the feces. So long story short, we observe many different options, that people can use and they have to navigate with. And so the interest is then what happens at the regime or at the sectoral level. This gives then rise, the combination of these different service sectors gives rise to different configurations that could be observed. And we said, well, the urban water management as it exists and as I portrayed it before in the slides has a sort of a monolithic character. So the sector and the main technology and the regime and everything has one form and is uncontended. But this is only true for a few sectors. Let's say already in the transport sector, you have different service regimes, and they might function better or worse on their own, and they might be aligned or not so well aligned among themselves. And so we identified that as a sort of a polycentric regime at the sectoral level. If it's well aligned, like transport in the Netherlands, or I would say cycling and automobility in the Netherlands, the public transport is another thing. Or then it can happen in a sort of more fragmented form, like in the US, where these transport modes are much less aligned among themselves, and where de facto, the automobile is sort of the dominant form of providing services. And so in this gradient, we said then what we observe in the informal settlements, we call this a splintered regime, because the individual service regimes are not very well performing, and you also don't have good alignments between them. So what you get is actually sort of a gradient from, let's say, the conventional understanding of transitions, which was formed around the electricity sector, where everything sort of ends up in a monolithic structure, and where you can then also easily say, oh, the transition is from one monolithic structure to a next to the monolithic structure, and the change agent is the niche. Whereas if you're in a splintered regime context, you might observe then quite fundamentally different transformation or transition processes. Still, you would say the new service options have to overcome the resistance from established practices. So whatever you want to do to introduce a new technology or these container-based solutions will hurt the established rules that exist already in the place. And you will always have actors that will fight for their rent positions, even, community-based organizations, residents, they will say, no, I can work on the public toilet, and now they want to do it, so they're breaking my business, et cetera, et cetera. So you're always hurting against these sort of established structures. But the overall pattern of the transition might then look more like a sort of a lateral drift than a linear substitution. So, the nice S-curve that just makes the transition from one stage to the other becomes something much more blurry and multidimensional. Okay, so let's say this was the first half of my talk. Just to say, well, what is transitions and how do they have to, or transitions concepts, and how do they have to be rethought if you are in more complex situations? I would like to stress here, this will come back, the informal settlement was only the discovery context in which we were pushed to say, oh, the old paradigm, the exemplar, doesn't work anymore, so we have to change our frameworks. But there's nothing specific to the informal settlements. Of course, in an informal settlements, you have then to analyze what's the local conditions, but we use this sort of conceptual framework also to analyze the difference between urban and rural diffusion trajectories for electromobility in Germany. And it works equally well, So there's nothing specific informal settlement in it. But if we hadn't gone to the informal settlements, we would never have thought in these terms, Okay, so let me now go to the urban planning, So how can these sort of, quite challenging and a bit abstract ideas of social technical and systems and regimes, these rules structures become useful or performative in an informal settlement upgrading, or let's say to urban management or urban planning more generally. So again, informal settlement upgrading, in our history or biography, mental biography, this was sort of a thing we had analyzed a lot on what would it take to improve the sanitation situation. So a single technology, single sector or service orientation. But then, of course, you see very quickly that people also don't care so much about these options because they also have lots of other problems, So the priorities are not, and lots of the interventions are like that. Oh, we bring you a toilet, you should be happy. And people say, no, it would be nice to have a toilet, but it would be nice to have many other things as well. And so the bigger challenge is, of course, how can you develop, let's say, urban areas that really lacks tremendously of infrastructure, basic infrastructure. How can you improve them in a substantial way? And that's, let's say, the definition of informal settlement upgrading, where there has been no infrastructure, which is not true, you will see, but let's say very low performing infrastructure to bring in better infrastructure and through this improve the livelihoods of people. What we see is that, of course, this is a huge problem globally. Urbanization rates are exploding. Lots of urbanization dynamics in the global south happen through informal settlements. That's sort of the entry gate. And then there's sort of this continuous building up. There are substantial investments made by all sorts of actors, the World Bank, the national organization, the urban planning ministries, NGOs, etc. So it's not that no one is taking care. Lots of people are focused on that and want to improve that. And in general, I would say, well, that's perhaps due to my ignorance, but my perception of the field is that there's still quite a technocratic approach to say, oh, we have a problem. People have mud roads, so we have to pave the roads. But it has sort of, taken on the social science component because, okay, we should perhaps first ask the people what they wanted and how they want it. So this is the thing about participation, So we have a technocratic approach that has been sort of revised a bit through participation. And the problem is we still see a very high number of non-functional interventions in a sense of, well, now the question is, what do you want to achieve, in particular on the improvement of livelihoods of people? And so the question that we asked ourselves, can we, through this lens of the socio-technical regimes and systems, can we better understand why this happens and why the performance is so low, and then ultimately, hopefully, also say, well, how could you do it better? So our approach was first to say informal settlements can be conceptualized and understood as socio-technical and socio-economic systems. Going back to one paper that elaborated that. So really adopt a very explicit socio-technical lens and then see how far this takes us and whether we get any sort of interesting insights through this inroad. And a second important assumption, but that's more like ontological or moral, to say we want to see or understand the strategies of the actors, of the residents in the informal settlements as rational actors and not as, as it's often portrayed to say, oh, we asked them what they want. They said a paved road. We delivered a paved road. No, we don't want it. So they are sort of irrational because they don't know what they want, And so this is, of course, a sort of a poor understanding of what the conditions are. And so, I hope you can follow me now. Our major conceptual inroads were two. The first one was, well, let's analyze the structural conditions, which means the rules that guide the practices of people to maintain their livelihoods, and then analyze when a new infrastructure is delivered, so analyze how this new infrastructure is appropriated. So what are the social processes that the actors apply in order to maintain the livelihoods or improve the livelihoods, etc. So we have a structural component and an agency component that come together. And I just have the two main papers I will refer to in the following are here, the double star and the triple star. And the first one was our inroad into this problem, which is, I cannot say more about the detail, but it's really a fascinating story about how many things can go wrong when you do this informal settlement upgrading processes. And I guess what we, let's say that the final point, how we approached it conceptually was to say, we want to measure upgrading success or understand upgrading success to looking more explicitly at the post-delivery process, which means that, sorry, I'm just was too quick. Here it is. So typically planners, urban planners, at least to my naive understanding, they're just very interested in the planning stage themselves. That's why they're called urban planners. So, what is the problem? How do we have to dimensionate a water pipe, et cetera, et cetera? Then it's perhaps also the implementation, to really, organize the process to implement the main, the water main, and then finally the delivery. And if everything has happened well, and if the participation was organized smoothly, then the assumption is then people have a nice piece of technology and they should be happy and they should accept it. And the means to guarantee acceptance is you go and ask them what they want. But we said, well, there's still a lot happening before, the impact on livelihoods will materialize. So the first one is the appropriation. So how will this newly delivered infrastructure be incorporated into the daily lives of people? Will then they decide to maintain it, to also put their own effort into it so that the technology can be maintained longer. And only then you will see the impact in terms of improved livelihoods or not. And I put here in brackets, this is the process that's also known as acceptance. And I have a very strong, resistance against this concept of acceptance because it collapses something into sort of a seemingly mental category. Do I like it or don't I like it? And if I don't like it, I don't take it up. Whereas this is a very complex process that I will now elaborate in more detail. But let's say that was sort of the focus that we set to better understand this causal chain, from the delivery of an infrastructure to then the impact on the livelihood. So the first one is the structural part. So what is the problem at the level of the rules when you introduce a new paved road or a new public toilet or street lights or whatever you might want to do, in a slum upgrading process? And so the first thing was to say we have to we cannot only address this problem through the socio-technical regime concept, but we have to try to understand the livelihood strategies of residents also with a sort of a regime from a rules point of view. And then only when I prepared this talk, I remembered that actually this goes back to an idea that Frank Geels had put in his 2004 paper. No one has taken this up in any shape or form, but actually it goes a bit in this direction too. So there's perhaps other realms in society that are shaped by certain rules, and we have to see how the social technical connects to these. And it's not rocket science. I guess we identified for the socioeconomics or the livelihoods side of things, we identified the production regimes, which means these are all the activities and the associated rules that organize the means for a living and that residents have to do. And this can be connected to salary work. It can be entrepreneurship, what you see a lot in formal settlements, hawking, or also illegal action, which is an activity at the same level as the others. And the second part is the reproduction regime. It sounds almost Marxist, production, reproduction. But let's say it's a lot about householding and family ties and leisuring. Also, these realms are, of course, structured by rules that shape what people do and how they can maintain a certain form of livelihood. But it's not only within the household, it's also the neighborhood and the social context, including religious or political activities. So if we analyze, the connection between the rule sets that are there to earn a living, the rule sets that are there to organize your private life, and then a new infrastructure coming in, which has also its associated rules, then it's an interesting question to say what happens here. So does this connect smoothly, or will there be any sort of problems emerging? And we did this again. This will come back, through these practice dimensions, of rules related to handling the artifacts and infrastructures, the organizational mode, time and space, and transactional and interactional rules. This is sort of the operationalization of how we did it. And we said, well, if there are misalignments among the newly delivered socio-technical system and the established socio-economic regime structures, then this will create some structural tensions. Then something people there will be some irritation. So if you had, let's say you had organized your life in an informal settlement in a certain way with without floodlights, and you chose your production activity as being a thief in the night, then the floodlights will just corrupt your business, and then you would have a sort of the rules of to run. It's not a very good example, but you get my point. It's when you introduce something new, it might just hurt the rules that you have to follow in order to live your life. So we did this empirically in in an informal settlement in the town of Naivasha in Kenya. And this was one of 80 informal settlement initiatives that are organized in the Kenyan national program of informal settlement upgrading. And we did 16 of them. And for this paper, we just looked at this one case. We had sort of an embedded case study design here. And to be very short, we had in Kasarani, this informal settlement, we had observed misalignments in solid waste and water drains, alignment with the floodlights and water provision, and a partial alignment with paved roads. And just to illustrate what that could mean, you see here a street in Kasarani before the upgrading, before the paving, and then the same street after upgrading. And what you see before, it was of course very difficult to get through by a car, especially if you didn't have an off-roader. You also see that goats were roaming, etc. Of course, everything is in a bad shape. When it's raining, then you have a lot of mud. It's very easy to say where the problem is. After that, the road is sort of tidy. It's paved, they will not have the mud problem. But now something interesting happens because apparently one person decided to dry the beans on the street, So we'll come back to that. So this is sort of meant to be a partial alignment for the road. But just to finish the story at the structural side, so we could aggregate, these three cases. And it was sort of a simple explanatory structure, of course. The floodlights were sort of aligned in all these dimensions that I had introduced. So not going into the details, but say the alignment then led in the end to a successful implementation and a positive impact on the livelihoods of people. The opposite was then for the solid waste unit, where you had misalignments almost through all the dimensions, and then there were no positive incomes, and the infrastructure was not really embedded in the settlement and decayed over time. And then the road case is sort of ambivalent. There were partial alignments, and there were hybridization of rules, and then we see a sort of mixed outcomes in terms of what the function and the the contribution of the road was to the livelihoods. I will come back to the case to give you a little bit more illustration just after the next. So now we have sort of identified sort of the types of conflicts or structural tensions in these different dimensions for the different infrastructures. And we could have a sort of prognostic framework to say, okay, well, it's also easy in a sense, if everything is just creates problems, then people will not react positively. If everything is smooth, then you would probably have a better situation. And in between, you will get some mixed results. But to really explain what happens, you really have to go to the agency dimension and look, what do people do when they're confronted with these structural tensions? So, well, first I have to say a caveat, because we got a lot of pushback from one reviewer for one of the papers, is to say, of course, we treat here these processes as sort of residents do, or in general, etc. And of course, there's a lot of individual exposure of individual actors in that. Informal settlements are very heterogeneous, and an intervention will have very different impacts on the life of people. So it's not appropriate to say, well, they all reacted as one, but that's not the point that we want to make. We want to identify like the mechanisms that are playing, and then how this really lands in a diverse situation needs then to be analyzed as sort of can be analyzed on top of that, And we should also distinguish between sort of the individual response. So how will an individual react when a new infrastructure is developed or provided, and what is the community response, And we would say, in the end, whether an infrastructure survives and has positive impacts depends also on these social processes of appropriation. But let's say appropriation, we then said we have to further conceptualize that. It's and we came up with like 3 steps or 3 phases. So the first is the reception. So once let's say the urban planners deliver the infrastructure, then the question is, what is sort of the immediate reaction of the residents? Will they welcome it, or are they critical? And what does this depend on? And this has a lot to do, of course, with the trust and how the participation process was done. Then the second phase is about the domestication. So we took that from old STS literature. So when the new artifact is delivered, of course, you have to find out how you incorporate this technology into your daily lives. And you might have to change some of the rules, that you normally use for running your productive activities or your reproductive activities. And you have to sort of realign the infrastructure livelihood nexus due to this new infrastructure that comes in. You cannot continue as it was before. And so the question is, how strong is this structural tension, and then it will need stronger or less strong actions. And we identified already from an earlier paper 4 strategy types: coping, which is more or less, adapting the rules that you follow normally, so to not be bothered by the new infrastructure. Navigating is finding sort of ways around. Negotiating is sort of about mobilizing resources in your social environment to deal with the new situation, and contravening is to then actively, fighting against the new thing that comes in. I cannot go into that in any detail, but let me just finish. And then the third step is then institutionalization. You can say reception and domestication might have still a stronger individual response level, but whether the infrastructure survives in the longer term will depend on whether there's sort of a social agreement, community endorsement and social agreement that is in new infrastructure has more benefits than problems. And then also sort of social policing will happen, to either maintain it or then to just say, just go do whatever you want with it, Okay, and if this is all successfully done, if this is sort of smooth, the reception, the domestication, and the institutionalization, then the new technology will be embedded and will be part of the real life or everyday realities, or it will just be rejected and destroyed at the one. So just the empirical context, this is from another case in Munyaka informal settlement in Eldoret in Kenya. And we saw, again, like 3 types of appropriation processes and outcomes. There were ablution blocks that were built in very correct technological form and everything. They were operational and everything. But the residents had already informed that most of them had access to other forms of on-plot sanitation options. And then the planning process was sort of, or the planning engineers were saying, yeah, but we don't have to do that because that's what's in the plans, etc. And so at the delivery, the residents were already against. Then they ignored it, and then people started to put the goats into the public toilets, and some thieves used it in the night as sort of hideaway. So you see, it became sort of translated into something that fit with the reproductive regimes of the residents. But of course, the infrastructure as such was very quickly eroded and transformed. The positive case was against the floodlights, and here the participatory planning and implementation was done sufficiently well. And then we saw that this embedding even led to co-production, so that the residents, when there were some technical issues over time with the floodlights, that the switching was not happening automatically. So they organized themselves to switch on and switch off at the right time, so to observe. So it became sort of a valuable part of their sort of activities. And then finally, the paved roads again. And I will elaborate here a few sentences more. So that the roads were, the problem definition of the roads upgrading was, oh, this is a traffic lane. And as you saw before in the picture, the cars and the vehicles, they are slowed down substantially. So we have to organize a street that will allow the traffic to happen much faster. And so that's how they operated it. So they took also away all the stalls of vendors, and identified a sort of separate market zone where they should locate. And then they paved the road and thought this would be good. And also the first effect was that then the traffic became much more seamless and rapid. Even providers from other parts of the city came in and provided services, so overall access was improved. But then, the vendors in the stalls, they decided to come back to the road, to put their stalls on the side of the road and encroaching the road, because they said, well, we want to be where the people are and not in this, the marketplace at the outskirts. So one of the other came back, then you had also this bean drying stuff. And then, of course, children played, and let's say that the rapid traffic became a sort of a problem for their safety. And so what the residents started to do was to put up dirt bumps, to slow down the traffic, but they were not very effective. So they negotiated with the government. So they put in real roadblocks so that the traffic was slowed down. So to me, this is a very nice story. The problem was originally that the traffic was too slow. So they intervened for that only in the end to end up with a slow road again, which was encroached by the stalls again. And so essentially you can say what has improved is that during rainy season, there is no mudslide anymore. But let's say for the road as originally conceived artifact, it has become something quite different. And the problem, of course, is to, let's say, the narrow-mindedness in the approach of the urban planning, because the road from the start, it was not only a traffic lane, but it was already a herding place, and a marketplace and a playground for children, etc. And so, the efficiency or the effectiveness of the intervention was very much slowed down. And even you could imagine that then also the maintenance of the road would deteriorate over time because of all these other aspects happening. So long story short, I guess what we try to bring here, of course, from our specific perspective, is to say that appropriation is a very proactive and a rational and a social process And yeah, you should understand it and approach it as such as an urban planner, and not, so reduce complexity and say, yeah, these are sort of rational actors, and we ask them what they want, they tell us what they want, that we deliver, and the market transaction is done. What you have seen in these cases is that this appropriation is a real process, where even the residents themselves, they cannot anticipate everything that will happen and how it will impact their lives, etc. Okay, so I'm a bit over time, but this is my last slide, I promise, or almost last slide. So let me just summarize two things, because I did two major steps, and that's also because if you feel tired, this is because there was a lot to digest, of course. So the first one was, explaining what this sustainability transitions framework is in the first place. And then what would it take, or what does it take, if you want to bring it to concepts, more complex concepts like the Global South? But, I said already that. And as I said already before, so for us, it was much more of a discovery context, to sort of test and further develop the framework than just saying, oh yeah, we know what the problem is, and we just apply the framework in a Global South context. So it was very beneficial to go there conceptually, and of course, one of the major learnings is that we have to move beyond this simple substitution process, or this S-curve, and see, we're getting into sort of much more murky and multidimensional transformation pathways, but that's sort of what it is, So it would be wrong to say, oh, it would be much nicer if this was a linear substitution process. It's just not the adequate way to approach it. So the elements for urban planning, I hope this should have been sort of clear by now, is this focus on livelihood conditions and rationalities of actors, or rationales of actors. And these structural tensions and appropriation processes are key for shaping forces that should be taken into account. And I guess this social technical perspective can sort of guide you. You could also do that from other perspectives, of course, and partially also others do that. Just very short, we had, in terms of, what are sort of the implications for practice, especially for urban planning, we have another paper that's published by now that looked at, sort of deconstruct participation. So what is participation really doing? What are the assumptions that you ask people at what stage of the development? And we could show that, you need different forms of participation at different stages of the development, even in the first phase of project delivery and implementation, that are sort of also dependent on the specific institutional logics of the actors that you have to deal with. I cannot go into that, but let's say we have also sort of relevant impacts on the level of the urban planning, the normal activities of urban planning. And then we also have a last paper on, which has also just been accepted. So what does this all say for the running of the whole program? The KISIP, this sort of national program with 80 projects to improve or upgrade informal settlements, and what should they take into account in order to be better prepared for these sort of things, So, very strong thesis to finish. A social technical paradigm shift would be needed for planning. Well, I'm not very serious because I don't know enough about planning to be very assertive here, but I'm very hopeful that we have discovered something that's really worthwhile. And so how this might then be taken up in urban planning is then, of course, a question that's still open. Let me just finish because I can also share the slides by the publications that are behind this. And I already referred to all the papers from George Gambuti, Wainaina. So he's Kenyan, and he will defend his his PhD 7th of July in Utrecht. And the former two PhD students, Mara von Wele and Pauline Chirunya, Pauline also being Kenyan, where we developed all this sort of sectoral regime and service regime, and how this then resonates, when certain actors like utilities or these NGO-driven initiatives or community-based organizations try to contribute to transitions in this multidimensional field and what sort of problems they encounter. So, you can then not only do this sort of high-level, high-flying conceptual frameworks, but also this guides you in a good way to then go into partial problems and etc. And just to very last slide, so you also see the faces of these people. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bernhard. Thanks so much for this.
It has been a lot again.
Also on transitions, I think, and interesting points to discuss for sure. Also for the people here on the internet, out there in cyberspace, you can just ask questions. I think we have to stop sharing somewhere. So I'm going to end the show. So you can. So because you should, through this Q&A button, you can also ask questions there. I hope I didn't close it. Okay, but let's start here. Also, we'll figure this out. Close down everything. So, anybody wants to start with a question?
It has been a lot. I'm aware of that. Yes. But you would never get so much information. Otherwise, you would have to read all these papers and make up your own mind,
Yeah, Ida?
Thank you. That was
Wait.
Yeah, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation. And I really also like this context of the presentation. But if you would draw some lessons, I mean, you're talking about the urban planning context, and of course that's very different in the global south than what it is in the Western world. But if you would use this framework that you have developed, like what would you bring in, and like what lessons how would we use it in our context, for example?
Yes. Well, I don't have a good answer, so I will just try to improvise a bit. Of course, in a formal settlement context, the problems are very, immediate and daring, etc. And the ways things can go wrong are so many. And let's say in urban planning, as in Sweden or so, much more is sort of organized along certain channels, etc. And typically also you don't have sort of, existing neighborhoods that you upgrade. Well, you might have that also, So then the question would be, probably, that there has been a lot of research also on, if you do upgrading in existing building stocks, and then you have to move people away, to return back again, and how this disrupts their sort of ways of living. That would be sort of a thing that could be analyzed in a similar way, But let's say I don't have a good answer. I would have to think better, about how this can be translated. Let's say the ambition of all this conceptual work is really to say this is sort of general theorizing. It's not a tailor-made framework for informal settlements in Kenya. That wouldn't make any sense. But rather to say, in order to address these problems in a proper way, we have to change the way we think and how we conceptualize the processes. And then in the next step, it's then to see how far we can apply this to other contexts. And this part about the urban planning is too fresh still. All these papers have just sort of finalized since a year or so. And we're happy, to have been able to bring all that, to pack all this in one bag. But the work then to generalize is still open, and I guess I should not continue. I would just kill myself by saying things that are not really there. But of course, it's a very good question.
Yes, thank you. Wait.
You need a microphone.
So then question there also.
Thank you for your knowledge sharing presentation. It was so nice. And I'm from Sri Lanka, as you talk about the global south. Instead of informal settlement upgrading in countries like Sri Lanka, it's doing like resettling people from initial where they live, and they resettle people and to new locations and so on. Do you have any experiences about those kind of projects in it?
Yes, that's a very good point. And this was the one paper that I had also on my list, which kickstarted our analysis into informal settlement upgrading, was actually a relocation story. And let's say that, well, there were many problems, of course, with relocations, but one of the major ones was to say, the assumption of the planners was that, well, people are in poor living conditions in terms of their housing structure. So we put them into better housing structures, and then we build new, and then they come back. So they should be happy all along because they're in much better housing structures. And the whole story about this, the informal settlement upgrading in Kibera was just a total disaster, and for many, many reasons. But one of the major drivers was that people could not really, profit from this relocation because it disrupted all their social networks, to earn a living, etc. So they were relocated to another place, not too far away from Kibera, actually at the borders of Kibera. And the problem was they lost all their sort of options for earning a living. They didn't have their personal ties were severed, etc. And then, of course, promises were not held. Instead of 2 years, it went 10 years, and so on. And lots of atrocities happened. But the major challenge was really to disrupt the livelihood structure. If you just uproot the whole system, and in informal settlements you have to be very active in connecting dots, and you have to rely on a lot of social capital around you. You have to invest, etc. And you cannot uproot the whole social system and put it into a new or temporary housing structure. So if you just take out individual households, then they will end up in a miserable state. And out of I don't remember exactly, but it was like 2,000 people that were relocated with the promise. And in the end, it was only like 50 or so that ended up in the new housing situation. So, a lot of things went really bad. And of course, you can say, well, it was bad planning, bad implementation. That all happened as well. But one of the major things was really that people were just disconnected from their resources, And so how to do this in a proper way? I could imagine in Sri Lanka, things are happening a bit in a better way, but this is sort of, a socio-technical regime sort of oriented perspective was also very useful for understanding what was going on there. Yeah. Well, that's what I would expect, because it's really, you try to solve a problem by purely a technology or a material strategy, and you don't consider all the social connections that are associated with it. And that's sort of the reason to say, well, in situ upgrading leads sort of, a lot of the social capital intact. And then you have to try to adopt, the infrastructure from there. But even here, and, paving a road, you would say, well, that's sort of an easy thing, you just put the bulldozer in and then put the tarmac on top, and, it's no rocket science. But still we see that these social processes play a very important role in them. So forget about relocating, It only strengthens my point in a sense.
Okay, so I'll bring in, we also have questions online here, and just bring them in the middle, at least one first, and then we can also get back here and then back here to online again. So one question from Artem is, it seems that top-down interventions in these formal settlements, so what planning would do not work well. But what would happen if there are no top-down interventions at all? Would the residents be able to improve the living environment if they would get the resources for that? So is the message towards better planning? So that this would be kind of the solution to that, or is it about more empowerment for the residents? So how could you deal with those questions?
Yeah, I think it's not either or, you know, in a sense, if you would do planning better along the lines that we, you know, propose, then you need much more empowerment by the people, you know. But I guess the other thing is to say, well, just hand out a little bit of cash and then people have to organize themselves. There have been a few of these initiatives, and I guess in particular in South Africa. And the evidence is also mixed because, you know, the residents will also reach limits in terms of their capitals and what they can mobilize. So to have someone who knows how to pave a road is also an important asset, you know, instead of you having to find out how to do it properly. So I guess it's not, the solution is not by saying, yeah, you should just, you know, leave everything to bottom up. I would rather bet my money on saying, well, we have to reform the planning trade, you know, to say, well, you really should become more social science informed and you know, problematize even from the start to say, what is the problem to be solved? You know, to say, well, this needs sort of a broader analysis than what is normally done, you know. That would be the short answer. Yeah.
Then I might ask a question then also from my side, because before you're asked again, and we can take up others here, but so the moves which you made were on the one hand compared to more traditional transition approaches, to say. So on the one hand, this move to the global south, wasn't it, where you had then this splintered regime. So this was and the other one, which I think was actually in this respect the more important one, is then this livelihood approach. Wouldn't you then say that kind of, or for me, the key point is that you move into life world contexts now, you know, from the transition socio-technical regime perspectives, which have their specific logics, which are, you know, kind of purified in a sense that you look at these particular configurations. But here you are suddenly in a life world context, and also the livelihood, which could be a household, which can be a neighborhood, which can be a city, even. So there are different ways, and where all these different infrastructures and regimes come together, and where you have different, you know, logics also of, you know, everyday life. So to say, you could analyze, you know, it's often called like bundles of practices, so which I'm not sure whether I would call it regimes then, you know, what's going on there, but you have different ways of how, you know, coherence in institutions and practices and expectations is created there, and which you then see, you know, and this was for me then also the point about planning, you know, that plan. So it's rather about a certain perspective of planning, you know, which takes this, you know, socio-technical, economic, this technocratic rationality, kind of, you know, you provide a new city district, for example, and then, you know, basically you don't have any agency more about how people appropriate, and this appropriation process is this integration in your everyday life.
Yes, yes.
So that's left out there, and this kind of probably also is something which is important for, you know, how dynamics of change look like. So they are not just this regime, socio-technical regime dynamics, but how they are processed and at this livelihood level maybe adds really a different type of dynamic of change. Because for otherwise, for me, you know, basically what we have with the livelihood and the global south is something which you could say, okay, that's just more prominent there in this context. So that, so you could say splintered regimes is something which we also have in the global north, maybe not so as pronounced as that.
Yes.
In livelihood questions we also have here, but maybe the difference then between global south and global north is that in our contexts, there is just much more alignment between this everyday life practices and the socio-technical realities, and you know, that we are just also in our, because the regimes are much more dominant, we are just more adapted to
Mhm.
those, and there these connections are still much more loose in these splintered contexts of the global south and these livelihood situations.
Mhm.
But it's not something, also the points which you make also about planning are not then limited to livelihood in the global south. This would be much
Yeah.
broader, isn't it? But would you also say that's more this everyday life context which then comes in and which lies across, and you could go to different levels, which is really across this regime structure?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't want to say this is the only legitimate perspective. And of course, you can approach it from bundles of practices. And I bet that this has been done before. So our inroad was really through this social technical system lens, and so it would be interesting to see how far can we get and how does this fare relate in relation to a purely practice approach. I guess the informal settlement upgrading thing is sort of like a quasi real world experiment, because you have the, let's say, the practices, bundles or regime like etc. that are there, and you put something new into it, and then things have to rearrange. So in that sense, I guess for our purpose, it's sort of a perfect empirical case. If you would say, well, let's just observe the improvement of livelihoods in a certain informal settlement over very long periods of time, and you don't have much of an infrastructure upgrading in it, then probably our perspective would not add so much. So in that sense, I guess it's more like specifying where is the sort of the specific added value that we can perhaps generate. You still have to prove it, but at least so far it's I guess we could measure up to our own ambitions, what we would like to explain, and the sort of assumptions that we have to make, and it worked well for this case. So now what you're saying is, well, if you come from another route, or you would say, well, we have more general urban planning measures, then we would still have to check how far we can get with the social technical perspective compared to other legitimate perspectives. That would be my short answer.
Yes. Wisdom is here on the list, but let me read first one question again. So
Mhm.
to switch a little. So one question of an attendee is, what do you think about the social ties and neighborliness residents? So the social ties which residents have in informal settlements, probably more than the individualistic lives of the Western world, I assume. How does this impact, so these ties, on the technocratic approaches?
Yes, that's a very good point. But I would say also in Switzerland, especially if you raise kids, you're relying a lot on your social relations. Again, but of course, let's say in a resource scarce environment like an informal settlement, you will even depend more on it. So we had this as a part of our four-pronged strategy, where like two of the strategies were relying on in-house resources, so to speak, and two were relating to socially accessible resources. And then two is a four-way table, and two are within the legal and moral frameworks, and two are sort of breaking with the legal and moral expectations. So that was the point that how we brought this in what I showed you here. We have one of the papers where we looked more at the processes at the household level. And there we developed a concept that has a horrible name, but it works quite well, namely oscillating domestic spaces, which means that, especially in these informal settlements, the space where you have access to your daily needs and requirements is sort of shifting depending on almost daily and seasonally changing conditions, also whether you're sick or you're old, or so there's many different things that determine how you organize your everyday life in space also. And there, of course, one of the key resources is where are your resource stocks, and depending on that, you will just have to go in a certain direction to meet people that you know and that you trust, etc. So this is a very important dimension. I fully agree. And it has a bit to do with our approach that we chose to treat residents as sort of a homogeneous group. And if we would go into, problematize this a bit more and go for individual sort of resource stocks, etc., then the social dimension would come in very strongly.
Yes, and wisdom.
Good, wisdom. Last question.
Thank you.
All the pressure is on you.
Bernhard, for a very interesting presentation and discussion. So far, I try to keep it short. So Hannah and I are doing some studies in Brussels on biogas systems diffusion. And we set off from the point that, okay, the S-curves and these simple technocratic perspectives do not work enough in explaining how the systems diffuse or not. And then we move on to adopt some perspective. And the perspective that we adopt is that of Smith and Reven, where they talk about this interaction between niches and regimes, fit and conform, or
stretch and transform.
But then we do not end there alone, but we also combine this with societal embedding and say that there are kind of 5 different environments which this interaction is happening in between. So there is the user environment, cultural environment, business, and local environment. And we see quite similar things to what you see, like there's kind of hybrid interactions, and sometimes the technology fits or it doesn't fit. But what we see is also that technologies which fit the existing regime diffuse quite faster. So for example, if it's a landfill gas capturing for biogas, then it's easily accepted and it's really upscaling. But then when you bring in solutions which are really disruptive to the regime, then it's quite much resistance and it takes much longer time to develop and so on. So I guess my question is what really does the social practice bring to the table? And then what do you see on this approach that we kind of adopt? Is it something interesting, another way of looking at this problem, or is like, yeah, so those are my questions.
Well, there's a social practice perspective. So we, as I introduced it, we chose it more as an epistemological device to say, okay, if we want to identify what the regime is in an informal settlement, then we would go, no one has done this ever to identify a regime, which is, by the way, also probably don't know how to measure the regime or identify the regime in the first place. But one way would be to say, oh, let's just make a long list of the rules that are operating and that are sort of shaping the development of an established sector. And the point is, it was not even made by us in the first place, but by Jim Murphy and colleagues to say, well, the practices can also be an epistemological device to see the operation of rules through the regularity of the behavior of people, and we didn't engage further, and we also took the dimensions, from the practice discussion, but we didn't. What we do is not really a fully fledged practice approach. So, it also relates to your approach. I would say, well, the pure practice approach would probably frame and the system in a different way, So, but we try to go in there to at least have some complementarities. As for your approach, I cannot judge that, so quickly. I guess one of the problems that we have in the transitions field is that we're still stuck with this sort of simple understanding, that there is one sector that has a dominant regime and it's all established, and then it will be supplanted by something else. And this is sort of a dichotomous situation, which worked well for the electricity, the energy transition, at least for the electricity part. It still works sufficiently well for urban water management, but already if you go into transport, it becomes a bit of a shaky approach. And if you get into more complex relations, and biogas, I would count that into, and then this doesn't work so well anymore. So let's say fit and conform, stretch and transform is sort of a very generic pattern, and I guess that's, you can identify it as all the time. But as you said, well, I cannot judge that from what you said, is to say, define the system boundaries in a new way is certainly the decisive step, to say, okay, now we have several sectors, and biogas has agriculture and has energy and has all sorts of things. And how can we now analyze this interactive set of subsystems in a coherent way. I guess that's a good approach to the problem, but I would have to read the paper to seriously comment on it, and criticize it. But I guess that's the way to go. We cannot cling to these old simple ideas just because they're so old and they're so simple, but we have to, come up with better framings,
So we are getting overtime already.
Yes.
Let's just maybe read one last question because we started a little bit later then. And apologize because here the questions are lining up already.
Oh, good.
Apologize to everybody. Those questions is not taken up, but we are running out of time, unfortunately. So Francesca is asking, so she thanks for an interesting presentation, and she has a question about the limits that might still persist in using socio-technical transition theory in the global south. Because an important literature on urban infrastructures in cities of the global south in geography and planning doesn't use this theory to explain socio-technical change, because it's so much north, so to say. And you try to adapt, but are there still parts which are remaining and which don't fit to this global south context?
I'm always very reluctant about, essentializing the global south because, you can do so many things so wrong. But I would say, of course, what the critical theories are emphasizing much more is the whole power dimension, and how this comes in. And that's not included in what we do, so we, we certainly don't have a strong and original take on how power dynamics come in, or colonialism, or very deeply held structures, etc. But this is also, in my view, this cannot be the goal to have a theory of everything, that will explain everything at the same time. What we try to do is to make the best from the, what we have developed in the field of transition studies, to make it sort of operational and productive and effective in such a context. But then, you could have a practice perspective, you could have a critical perspective. There are more legitimate dimensions that you can apply to better understanding and perhaps even solving the problems. And we should do that, It's not like, it's just mobilizing one framework to say that's the one that will explain everything, because it won't, And, we could now go into why I don't believe that critical theory will be the one that will explain everything, even if many people believe that. Or also the social practice is also limited in itself, but I guess that's with all the approaches, you have certain limitations that are necessary to hold on in order to formulate the frameworks in a coherent way, If you want to be open in all the dimensions, nothing will come out in the end. And so it's more like, there's sort of an interaction to be had between the different perspectives, and we have perhaps not been very good at that until now. We have to improve on that front, and then perhaps from this interaction from the different perspectives, we can really process a step further, and get really a much deeper understanding of the challenges and the solutions, hopefully.
Thanks, Bernhard. Nice concluding words.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
And sorry for everybody whose questions haven't been answered. Thanks so much for coming.
But could you save them and then?
We can save them. Feel free also to answer. We'll see whether you can still answer them, or
okay.
Send a short message or so back.
Yes.
There are some interesting questions remaining. But
I would be eager to see them.
Yes.
Yeah, of course.
Definitely. Okay, and thanks everybody for participating and coming here. Thanks so much.
Thank you.